This video was brought to you by Nebula. Yesterday was a major test for Rishi Sunak, as the UK held 3 key by-elections. Now, while Sunak did avoid the indignity of becoming the first Prime Minister since Wilson in 1968 to lose 3 by-elections in one day, they did still lose 2 of the by-elections to Labour and the Liberal Democrats, both of whom beat the Tories by huge majorities. So in this video, we'll take you through each by-election, the background, the results, and what this all means going forward. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. We're going to begin with the by-election in Uxbridge and South Ruislip, which was perhaps the most keenly watched as it was Boris Johnson's old seat. But let's dive into the results. Despite the expectation that Labour would win this seat comfortably, the vote ended up being a lot closer than anyone expected. In fact, it was so close that a recount was conducted. Ultimately, this ended with the Conservatives securing a majority of just 495 seats, with Tory candidate Steve Tuckwell securing 13,965 seats to Labour candidate Danny Beale's 13,470. In the end then, this 6.7% swing from Tory to Labour just wasn't enough for Labour to get their candidate onto the green benches. It's additionally worth noting here that if Labour are to win the next general election, they need to win an additional 123 seats across the country compared to 2019, which requires a swing of around 10%. Regardless, this West London seat in particular was always going to be a key target for Labour, whether in a by-election or a general election, as Boris Johnson won it in 2019 by a relatively small majority of around 7,000 votes. Despite this, Conservative activists in the area successfully managed to make the by-election a referendum on London Mayor Sadiq Khan's controversial ultra-low emissions zone, or ULEZ. Voters, clearly frustrated that they'd be asked to pay more to drive their own cars, took this out on Labour and denied them what many saw as a seat that was theirs to win. Now, it's worth tempering this by saying that although Labour lost, this isn't the end of the world for them. This loss in particular can be attributed mainly to a local issue, one in which Labour's messaging was confused at best. Of all the by-elections then, this probably isn't the one to be extrapolating out nationally in order to predict the next general election result. With that in mind, let's move on to the next by-election in the North Yorkshire constituency of Selby and Ainsty, which was left vacant by Nigel Adams, who resigned from Parliament a day after Boris Johnson. And here are the results. Unlike in Uxbridge, Labour were successful here, winning a majority of 4,161 seats, with a swing of 23.7%. Now, as we mentioned before, Labour needs around a 10% swing at the next general election in order to win the keys to number 10. So a swing of 23.7% nationally would easily do it, and would actually mark a larger swing than that achieved by Tony Blair in 1997. Even putting that wild extrapolation to one side, this does mark the largest Labour by-election victory in history. And ultimately, that's the big story here, that Labour managed to overturn a 20,000 vote majority that the Conservatives won in 2019. And by proving that they can win a rural seat considered safe for the Tories since 2010, it greatly expands the list of seats that are realistically up for grabs by Labour, and will make a sizable number of Conservative MPs sitting on similar majorities very nervous. Ultimately, Labour will be hoping that Selby and Ainsty, instead of Uxbridge, is more of an indication of what we can expect at the next general election. The final of Thursday's by-elections was the one in Somerton and Frome. Conservative MP David Warburton resigned from the seat after a string of scandals, including cocaine usage, failure to declare loans and donations, and alleged sexual misconduct. So let's take a look at the results. In the end, the Liberal Democrat candidate, Sarah Dyke, won the seat with over 21,000 votes, or 54.6%, while the Conservatives came in second with just over 10,000 votes, or 26.2%. That's nearly a 29% swing from the Tories to the Lib Dems, and a major gain for them, as they overturned a majority of 19,000 votes. Now, while it was, as the Lib Dems said, a two-horse race between them and the Tories, it's also worth noting that the Green Party secured an impressive 10% of the vote, doubling their share since 2019. Nevertheless, with the results in, Lib Dem leader Ed Davey declared that his party is firmly back in their West Country stronghold. Now, that's in reference to the fact that Somerton and Frome had previously been a battleground between the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats, as had much of the southwest of England before the Lib Dems collapsed in support in 2015. So Thursday's result is yet more evidence that the party is a fighting force in the region once again, which, considering the Tories' strong performance there recently, ought to be a concern. So thinking about that, are Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives worried? And how have they reacted? Well, before the by-elections, Rishi Sunak had attempted to manage expectations by saying that midterm by-elections for incumbent governments are always difficult. I don't expect these to be any different. However, now the results are in, the Conservatives do have at least one seat to celebrate: Uxbridge and South Ruislip. Former Prime Minister and ex-Uxbridge MP Boris Johnson tweeted that it shows the Conservatives can win in London and across the country. One Tory MP even remarked that it was stunning for the government to win a midterm by-election in London and meant that it was all to play for at the next general election. As we've already said, it was won by the Conservatives on a local issue, so while it does give them hope that they can campaign on local issues and win elsewhere, it's not necessarily reflective of national trends. Polling expert Professor John Curtis said that although Uxbridge will provide Rishi Sunak with some immediate cover, maybe in the end the message from these by-elections is that the Conservatives are indeed in considerable electoral trouble along the lines that the polls are suggesting. As for the Tories' two losses, though, they were the latest in a string of defeat for the Conservatives, who also endured brutal losses at the more than 1,000 council seats in the local elections back in May. Meanwhile, current polling continues to suggest that they may be on course for a historic loss at the next general election. Perhaps most concerning for the Conservatives, though, is that on Thursday, they lost on two different fronts to two different parties, highlighting that they're being squeezed from multiple directions. That means that the West Country has been revived as a competitive battlefield with the Liberal Democrats, and Labour have proven that they can take seats from massive Conservative majorities. So the Conservatives do have cause for concern. Now, they're going to have to try and reconfigure in the wake of the by-elections, and different factions of the Conservative Party are likely to learn different things. Not only that, we're also fairly likely to see a cabinet reshuffle in the days ahead, and Rishi Sunak is reportedly planning on a major shift in gear ahead of the summer parliamentary recess. But it is hard to overstate, even with the Uxbridge result in mind, just how uphill a struggle it will be for him to turn round his electoral fortunes by the next election, which is expected to be around May 2024, but could be as late as January 2025. The reality is that the voters are still seriously concerned about the cost of living, the economy, and the state of public services. And when your party has been governing over all of this for the past 13 years, it's quite hard to convince the country to re-elect you for a fifth term. If you're interested in these kinds of things, you should check out Neo's series Underexposure. This beautifully produced series from one of our favourite creators runs through a number of shadowy and unexplained situations, from how the Twin Towers were built to the raid on Bin Laden, or the worst aviation accident in history. As I'm sure you can see, this series is stunningly produced, and the research behind it is honestly even more impressive. If that sounds good to you, then you can watch this series alongside a load of others which perfectly complement TLDR videos exclusively on our streaming service, Nebula, where you can also find a bunch of TLDR content too. That's because we post all of our videos ad-free on Nebula, as well as sharing some of our videos there before they ever make it to YouTube. Not only that, we also release hours worth of content only on Nebula every month, from extended editions of our show The Daily Briefing to exclusive explainers and behind the scenes clips. And the good news is that all of this, TLDR content, exclusive documentary series, and a bunch of other brilliant creators are available at a great price. That's because if you sign up using our link in the description, then you can get Nebula for less than £2 a month. So help out the channel and learn more by signing up to Nebula. Thanks for your support.